The sun rose over Rome like a dull coin. It did not warm everyone. In the narrow streets behind the Forum, smoke from cook fires mixed with the smell of leather, oil and old fish. A chain rattled somewhere, a cartwheel squeaked, voices rose and fell like the tide. But inside one large townhouse, a domus owned by a stern senator, everything moved in a tight rhythm of orders and obedience. The slaves began before the city was awake. They lit coals. They swept stone floors with straw. They carried water in earthen jars that cut into their palms. They rubbed the bronze lamps with wool until each one caught fire and shone. They laid out bread and olives for breakfast. They spoke in whispers or not at all. Their feet made soft sounds on the mosaic floors. They knew which door hinges creaked and which ones must not. In this house lived many kinds of enslaved people. Some were born on a country estate and sent to the city as children. Some were bought in markets far away, taken in wars or seized by pirates or sold by desperate parents. Some wore neat tunics and carried writing tablets, for they served near the master and knew his schedules. Others lived in the cellar and came out only to haul, scrub and lift. The house had eyes everywhere. Stewards, a doorkeeper, a tutor for the master's son, a cook, a young girl who ran errands and never looked up, and an older man who had lost 3 teeth and smiled anyway. All were slaves. All had learned one skill above all others: how to read danger on a master's face. The law called them property, things that could be bought and sold. A Roman could sell a slave like he sold a chair. He could rent out a slave for the day. He could give a slave as a gift. He could break a slave and not answer for it, at least in most periods of Rome's long life. Some emperors tried to restrain the worst acts. Some said a master should not kill a slave without cause. But cause was a wide net, and the trap was always ready. For slaves, the safest path was silence and speed. In the morning, in the noon heat, in the slow blue hour before sleep. Tiro, a thin young man with quick hands, served as a house attendant. He woke before first light. He knew where the master kept the seal ring and the keys. He knew how to fold a toga with crisp edges. He knew the signs that told him whether the day would pass in calm or be torn open. If the master squinted at the first bite of bread, the kitchen would suffer. If the master rubbed his forehead, the scribe would be blamed. If the master laughed too loudly at a guest's joke, the wine would flow and Tiro would stand straight and pour, 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 until the moon was high and the lamp oil low. He also knew the tools that waited in the back room beside the stable. Every house had some form of them. A knotted cord, a leather lash with small metal studs known as the flagrum, a pair of iron shackles with a ring for a chain, a branding iron with a simple mark. In some places, on large farms far from the city, there were small prison rooms called ergastula, where chained men slept and rose for field work. In the city, the walls were closer, but the fear was the same. The master's hand could call for pain, and pain would come. Punishment in Rome had a shape and a logic. At least, that is what masters told themselves. Small faults met small pains, larger faults met heavier blows. The worst acts ended in death, sometimes slow. But fault was not a simple thing in a house where one person held the power of many lives. A dish could break in a servant's hands, and that could be called an insult to the master's honor. A whisper could be called a lie, a simple delay could be called theft of time, a glance could be called disrespect, a rumor could be called truth if it pleased the ear that judged it. The morning Tiro carried fresh water to the master's room, he saw the first sign that the day was turning. The master's wife held a broken clasp, a small bronze piece carved like a leaf. She had found it near the chest where her jewelry lay. Her face was pale with anger, but her voice was colder than her face. "Someone has put hands where they do not belong," she said. The master's eyes went narrow. He nodded once. He said nothing to his wife. He only looked to the steward, who understood. A search began. Boxes opened, linen bundles were shaken. The steward checked the sleeping pallets of the cellar. He ran his hand along the ledges where mice scurried. He spoke with the wet nurse, the cook, the tutor, the boy who raked the charcoal embers. The house grew very quiet. Above the courtyard pool, a pigeon cooed, and the sound felt too loud. Tyro felt the old tightening in his chest. It was a feeling every slave knew. It was the rope that could tighten around any neck at any time. He had never stolen. He had learned to keep his eyes low and his hands quick and clean. But guilt was not always about actions. In a Roman house, guilt could be a space that needed filling. Someone would be chosen to fill it. Near the kitchen, a girl wore a leather collar. On the collar, stamped into the leather, were words that said she belonged to this house, and that if she ran away, anyone could seize her and return her for a reward. Some collars were iron and heavier, thick bands that cut the skin. In the markets, runaways were branded on the forehead with letters that meant fugitive. In the city, one could see the scars if one looked. The sight worked like a whisper. Remember your place. Tiro passed the doorkeeper, a man with a scar on his back from an old flogging. The man said nothing. He only touched his own collar and then touched his lips. It meant, be still. It also meant, the storm is coming. Punishments varied by place and time. Flogging was common. The flagrum, with its strips of leather and bits of metal, bit into flesh and left round, purple wounds that healed slowly and never fully. Masters used it for correction. Branding with hot iron marked a body forever, a warning to all who saw. Chaining to a weight, like a small iron ball, made flight hard and work slow. Sending a slave to the mines, damatio ad metalla, was a death sentence written in dust and darkness. In the arena, being thrown to animals, damnatio ad bestias, was a public ending that matched Rome's hunger for spectacle, and for the most feared crime of all, killing a master. The law once held that the whole household could be punished, even the innocent among them. That law's shadow stretched across many centuries, and rooms like this one, it could fall on anyone. It could fall today. Yet Rome was not the same in every age. Some rulers, like Antoninus Pius, said that killing a slave without cause was a crime, that masters who punished with cruelty beyond measure might face the law. Another rule, the lex patronia, tried to stop owners from throwing slaves to beasts without the approval of a magistrate. These were limits drawn on parchment, but inside a house, power did not live on parchment. It lived in the hand that held the whip and in the eyes of those who stood nearby and did nothing. The steward finished his search and reported to the master. No jewelry was missing, only the broken clasp on the floor. Perhaps it fell. Perhaps the maid bumped the chest. Perhaps the hinge was weak. The master's mouth curved. He did not like perhaps. He called the household to the atrium. The air tasted like copper. The sunlight fell through the open roof in a rectangular beam. Dust hung there like tiny stars. They lined up, men and women, old and young. The master stood at the front with the steward to his side. He spoke in the calm tone of a man giving orders about grain or rent. He said a thing had broken. He said it might be carelessness or theft. He said a lesson would be taught so that the house would stand firm in discipline. He asked who had been near the chest that morning. The maid stepped forward. Her name was Darsa. She was small and careful, and had been bought 2 winters ago with a boy who died of fever. She said she had dusted the chest and folded the mistress's cloths. She said she had not opened the jewellery box. She said it quietly and with both hands against her sides. The master nodded, as if he had expected that answer. He ordered her to kneel. The steward brought the lash. Tiro felt his mouth go dry. He looked at the cook, who stared at the floor. He looked at the tutor, who pulled his lip between his teeth. No one moved. The law of the house was standing in front of them. It had a face. It had a voice. It always did. The first blow made a small sound, like wet leather slapped against a table. The second drew a thin cry from Dasa. The third came fast and hard, and after it they came in a rhythm that matched the master's breath. 10, 15, 20. The flagrum left round marks like tears of dark paint across her back. When she fell forward, the steward pulled her upright by the arm and continued. Tyro watched without breathing. He felt his own back flinch, although the lash was not on him. He wondered, as he always did, how much pain a person could hold before the body decided to go somewhere else. When it was over, Dasa lay still, but not fainted. The master told her to thank him for the lesson. She did. Blood ran in thin lines into the folds of her tunic. The master said the house was warned. He said the next sign of carelessness would meet a harder hand. He dismissed them. Work resumed, but the air stayed heavy. Fear leaves a taste, and the slaves could not spit it out. Tiro helped Dasa to the cellar steps. He washed her wounds with water from the jar and whispered words that were simple and clean. Breathe, drink, sleep if you can. He tore a strip from his own tunic and bound her shoulders. He knew the marks would swell, crust, and itch. He knew they would fade into scars like spilled wax hardened on skin. He knew the memory would not fade at the same speed. He also knew something else. Punishment did more than hurt. It taught a map of the mind. It drew borders around thoughts. It made a person learn to hide, even from themselves. In Rome, a slave learned to keep a second self deep inside. A self that watched, counted, remembered, and sometimes dreamed. That inner self might plan for small freedoms. A hidden coin saved from market errands, a kind word traded for an extra scrap of bread, a message carried between friends in the alley behind the bathhouse. Some found ways to buy their freedom through a small fund called a peculium, though a master could take it away. Some were freed for loyal service, set up as freedmen or freed women, and yet even they carried the marks of old fear. Others ran, many were caught. In the afternoon heat, the house slowed. The master met with clients. The steward checked accounts. The tutor drilled the boy in letters. A for aqua, water. B for bellum, war. C for civis, citizen. These words had weight that the boy could not yet feel. Tyro stood near the doorway and waited for orders. He thought about a friend he had known in a different house, a man sent to the mines because he had talked back when accused of stealing meat. The mines were a hole in the earth and a hole in time. Few returned. A clatter at the gate cut through the stillness. A neighbor arrived, a pale, nervous equestrian who lived down the street. He spoke fast to the doorkeeper, then to the steward, then to the master himself. The neighbor had trouble in his own house, he said. A knife had gone missing. He suspected a slave. He came to ask advice and perhaps to borrow a man skilled with the lash. The master listened, nodded, and offered the steward. He also told a story, one that made his neighbor shake his head and murmur, "By the gods." The story was old and it lived in many houses. Once, a master had been killed by his slaves. The Senate had decreed that every slave under that roof must die because no one had stopped it. And they did die, even those who had not lifted a hand. The law had teeth. Rome liked its teeth. The neighbor laughed. The steward prepared to go with him. The house trembled like a small animal hearing thunder far away. Tiro thought about the knife in the neighbor's house and the broken clasp here and the way fear traveled from door to door like a silent runner. He looked at Dasa, asleep at last, her breath shallow. He looked at the iron tools on the wall and the loop of chain at the end of the bench. He looked at the doorway to the street, bright with afternoon glare. He thought of running. He did not think about it in the way of boys who dream. He thought of it in the way of a man who knows roads, watches dogs, collars, brands, markets, and the hard hands of strangers. He thought of the Tiber with its muddy edges and slow barges. He thought of the sewers and the hills and the alleys where a runaway might hide for a day and not for two. He thought of the letters they would burn into his skin if they caught him. Fugue. He thought of the price on his head if the master offered one. He thought of the mines, the arena, the cross. Crucifixion stood behind all other punishments. It was the far wall of fear. Slaves and rebels and bandits knew it best. The cross turned a body into a warning sign by the road. It was slow, it was public, it was meant to teach. It said, "The law is not only written, it is nailed." Tira had seen a line of crosses once along the Appian Way, long after a revolt had ended. Birds had made nests in the wood. The wind had sung around the ropes. He remembered dropping his eyes and walking faster while carrying a basket he did not feel. By evening, the master's wife found the other half of the broken clasp. It lay under a fold of cloth in the corner of her room. The hinge had snapped from age. Nothing was missing. The steward returned from the neighbour's house with tired eyes and a quiet jaw. He had not said much there. He had only watched and let the neighbour show his hand. Back in the atrium, he reported the pointless noise of the day, the suspicion, the blow that fell, the stain that spread and then dried. The master shrugged. He said the house was now warned and would be more careful. He said the gods favoured order. He said many things that sounded like sense to ears that did not bleed. That night, Tiro sat on a step by the courtyard pool and watched the moon make a pale coin on the water. He held the broken clasp, now given to him to throw away. He turned it in his fingers. It was light. It was useless. It had also opened a door in his mind that he could not close. The house had punished, though no crime had been done. The lash had fallen where truth did not. The lesson was not about the clasp, it was about power. He thought of the map of punishments he carried in his head. Lash, brand, chain, collar, pit, mine, beast, cross. He traced that map with his thumb on the edge of the clasp until the metal warmed. He knew tomorrow would begin with coals and clay jars and wool and lamps, with bread and olives and the soft sounds of feet on stone. He knew everyone would move carefully, as if walking on a floor of thin ice. He also knew that fear can turn to something else when it grows too heavy. Sometimes it turns into a numbness that lets a person live. Sometimes it turns into a plan. In the darkness, one question rose like smoke he could not wave away. If a house can punish where there is no guilt, what can a slave do that is not a crime? And how can a human heart survive the weight of a law that bends toward pain? The moon slipped behind a cloud. Tyrol closed his hand around the clasp until the corners pressed his skin. He looked toward the doorway that led to the street. He listened to the quiet, and in that quiet he felt the first small stirring of choice, a choice that would open onto danger no matter which path he took. What happens when the lash teaches the wrong lesson and the one who learns it decides to answer not with a cry, but with a plan? Morning came without mercy. The courtyard was cool, the marble damp, the sky a pale grey bowl. Smoke lifted from the kitchen. The smell of wet wool and crushed olives hung in the air. Dasa rose slowly. Her back burned like a field on a summer day. Each step pulled at torn skin. She said nothing. She tied her hair, washed her face, and went to her work with eyes that did not rise above the line of her hands. Tiro stood near the impluvium and watched the ripples on the pool. The broken clasp lay hidden under a loose floor tile by the wall. He kept touching the place with his foot as if a small treasure slept there. It was not treasure. It was a sign. It said, "Remember." It said, "The lash fell when no crime was done." The master walked past, his sandals hard on stone. He gave orders about figs and letters and a guest who would come at noon. He spoke of prices and favours and a court case in which a friend needed a witness. He did not speak of the lash. His world had returned to its place, and everything inside his chest was calm again. Tyro was not calm. He poured watered wine for the master and his wife. He fetched wax tablets and reed pens. He folded a cloak. He burned a pinch of incense before the household gods and watched the smoke climb. He felt the small, steady beat of a new thought. It was not the wild thought of running to the hills. It was a narrow bridge between two cliffs. If a slave was treated with unusual cruelty, there was, in some times and places, a door they could try. They could go to the statue of the emperor in a public place and kneel there. They could ask to be sold to another master. It was not freedom, it was not safety, but it was a change of hands, a chance to live under a different roof. The rule was old, and not always honored. Some magistrates listened, some turned their faces away. Masters hated it. They said it invited insolence. But the emperor's image was power, and power sometimes cast a thin shade even for the lowly. Tyro had never used that door. He had seen two others try. One, a boy, made it to a statue by the market and knelt with his collar bright in the sun. A crowd gathered. The master came, red with anger. Elictor, one of the officers of the magistrate, stepped close, and the master's hand paused in the air. There was arguing. The boy trembled like a reed. In the end, the magistrate ordered a sale. The master spat and obeyed. The boy was led away. He was still a slave, but his back was safe for a season. The second was a woman who fled the whip and reached a temple of a goddess. She clung to the base of the statue until her fingers went white. The master hired men to pry her loose. They dragged her out and beat her in the street. No officer came that day. The law did not stand in front of her. She disappeared into a countryside farm where iron collars were heavy and the nights had no end. Tyro held both stories in his mind. He weighed them like a buyer testing a scale with a thumb on one side. For Dasa, the whip had already come. For the house, the lesson was already false. If he could move her to a new hand, perhaps he could tilt the world a finger's width toward mercy. He waited for a quiet moment. He found her in the storeroom, counting dried figs into a basket, her mouth set in a line that tried to be brave. He spoke softly. "Listen to me," he said. "There is a place where a slave can kneel and ask to be sold." Dasa did not look up. "If we run, they will mark us." "We do not run," Tyro said. "We walk in the open and kneel in the open. If an officer comes, he may hear." "What if he does not hear?" she asked. "Then we return before they call us thieves," he said. "But we must try fast, before the marks on your back fade to a story no one will see." Dasa set a fig down and finally lifted her eyes. Fear sat there. So did a thin, stubborn light that had not yet gone out. "They will call it insolence," she said. "They call it insolence when a slave breathes," Tyro said. "We must choose the kind that might save you." She stared at the figs. She counted 3, then stopped, forgot the number, and began again. The wound pulled at her voice. "How?" "The statue near the market," Tyro said. "Or the one near the basilica where magistrates walk. We need the statue of the emperor. We need eyes." "This house has eyes," she whispered. "All of them turned inward." "Then we borrow different eyes," he said. "The crowds, the officers, the laws, if it remembers itself." The plan was simple, which is to say it was a plan that could not hold many breaks without falling apart. At the noon hour, the master's guest arrived with a retinue and heavy talk of lawsuits. The house filled with voices. The kitchen steamed. The steward patrolled the line between order and show. Tyro poured wine, kept the cups even, and always knew where the master's right hand was. He watched it like a hunter watches the tail of a lion. When the hand was calm, the air was calm. When the hand tightened, storms blew up fast. In the crush of tasks, Tiro passed the doorkeeper twice. The man's scar showed at the collar as sweat darkened his tunic. Once, the doorkeeper's eyes flicked right toward the street, and only for a breath. Tiro saw it. He did not answer, yet he needed one more thing, a sign that they were not alone. A little before the 9th hour, a mule driver came to the kitchen entrance with sacks of grain. He was a free, poor man, old, with a back bent like a bow. He had served this house for years. He had the quiet, rough kindness of those who work with animals more than men. Tiro met him, measured out the grain and whispered, "If a slave kneels at the statue and the master raises a hand." The mule driver looked at him steady. "I shout when a beast is beaten for sport," he said. "I can shout for a person, but it is a thin thread." "We have no rope," Tiro said. The mule driver nodded once. "Tomorrow, the officers pass the basilica earlier than market time. Too many thieves. They like to be seen." He looked at Dasa, who had come for a water jug and held it like a shield. He spoke to her in a tone that did not bruise. "If you kneel, keep your head high, child. Make them look at your face, not only your back." The evening fell. Lamps were lit. The guests left. The house exhaled. The steward counted keys. The master's wife wrapped her hair. The tutor sent the boy to bed with a verse about duty that washed over him like rain he could not feel. In the corner, one of the cellar men coughed and turned on his pallet. Tiro moved to the courtyard. He slipped the broken clasp from under the tile and tucked it into his belt. He sat beside the pool and stared at the square of night above. The stars looked like seeds pressed into dark wax. He followed a line of them toward the hill where the basilica stood. He thought of punishment again, but not only as a lash. He thought of the ways it reached into a mind. It told you that your name did not matter. It taught you to say it was my fault when it was not. It made you forget the sound of your own judgment. The plan he was building was not only for Dasa's back. It was for that inner thread, the one that said a person was still a person. He slept little. He woke before the light. He helped light coals and warmed oil and gathered bread. He picked up a small handful of coins he had hidden long ago in a crack that the steward never checked. They were not for bribes. They were for speed, to pay a porter to move a crowd, to buy a pitcher and spill it so people would step aside, to call eyes where they needed eyes. When the hour came, Tiro spoke to the doorkeeper, and the doorkeeper listened without speaking. He had learned long ago to keep his mouth shut unless it held an order. But he had also learned that not all keys hang on the same ring. He glanced left and then right. No one stood near. He shifted the bolt with a soft click. "For the love of any god who watches," he breathed, "be back before the steward calls the count." Tiro took Dasa by the arm. They wore plain tunics and no cloaks. He carried a basket with a cloth over it. Inside lay nothing but the coins and a piece of stale bread. They stepped into the street. Rome at morning was a river of bodies and noise. Donkeys snorted, wheels clacked, vendors called, a barber scraped a man's chin, a woman scolded a child who had stolen a plum. The air carried soot and baking and the sharp bite of human waste from the gutter. The sun cleared a roof and laid a strip of gold across a wall. They moved with the flow. They did not run. Running makes a watcher run also. At the corner, Tiro bought a small cup of watered wine from a girl and pressed one coin into her hand, then another. "If I drop this cup and it breaks," he said, "and a man lifts his hand to strike, point with your whole arm and shout, 'Officer,' as if your own father is in danger." The girl looked at him. She was 12, maybe 13. Her life was all corners like this, all cups, all coins that slipped away. She nodded. "If a man lifts his hand to strike, I shout without coins," she said, "but I will point too." They reached the basilica steps. Officials moved in and out like ants from a nest. A pair of lictors stood near, rods on their shoulders, axes bound inside. Not far from them, a bronze statue of the emperor faced the forum. Its eyes were blank. Its hand was raised, not in fury, but in calm show. Pigeons had left white marks on the base. Flowers lay there from someone's prayer, or someone's hope, or someone's show of loyalty. Dassa's breath came short. Sweat stood on her lip. Tiro felt her arm tighten. "If I fall," she whispered. "You kneel," he said. "Do not fall." They stepped into the open space. Tiro tipped the cup. It slipped and broke, a small, sharp sound. He did not need the noise. He needed to feel his hand do something he could control. He and Dassa crossed the stones and reached the statue's base. She knelt. The motion was slow and exact. She placed both knees down. She set her hands on the bronze, palms open, fingers spread. She lifted her face so the light fell on her cuts even through the wool. Her eyes did not drop, she did not beg, she presented. Around them the city paused, in the way a city does when something new appears in its field of sound. Heads turned. Not all. Enough. The mule driver was there, a sack on his back. He stopped and stared and drew a breath into a chest that had shouted at stubborn beasts for 30 years. "Officer," he called. It was not a shriek, it was the hard, simple bark of a man who is used to being obeyed by things on 4 legs, and sometimes by things on 2. The 2 lictors turned. One spoke to the other. A clerk came down the steps with a tablet in his hand and ink on his fingers. A magistrate was not far behind, trimmed beard in careful lines, a white band on his tunic that said he had the right to judge today. Tiro felt his knees go loose and locked them again. The clerk stood in front of Dassa. "Whose slave are you?" he asked. She told the name of the master and the street. She spoke slowly, each word a stone. "I kneel because the whip was used in anger and not in justice," she said. "I ask to be sold." The clerk looked at her back. He looked at her hands. He looked at Tiro. "Are you with her?" "I am a witness," Tiro said. "I saw what was done." The clerk's eyes slid to the lictors. One had started forward, the other watched the edges of the crowd. The magistrate had reached the bottom step now. He did not speak yet. He watched the shape of the air. Then, like a hawk's shadow crossing a field, the master appeared. He had come fast, the steward at his shoulder, jaw tight. Something in the house had warned him, perhaps the doorkeeper's silence, perhaps the absence of 2 bodies at a count, perhaps the way a morning can tilt and a man who loves control feels the floor tip under him. He did not walk. He moved. He pointed at Dassa. "Get up," he said. "You shame me." Dassa did not move. The master lifted his hand. He had struck many times in his life. The hand knew the path. Before it fell, the lictor stepped between. The rods lay quiet on his shoulder, but his body took the space. "Not here," the lictor said. The master turned his anger from the slave to the man who blocked him. "This is my property," he said. "This is the emperor's image," the lictor answered. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The rods were a language. The magistrate spoke at last. He asked the clerk, "Name?" The clerk gave it. The magistrate asked, "Back?" The lictor nodded once. "Fresh," he said. The magistrate's face was calm, like a man weighing grain. "You have enemies in this city," he said to the master, almost as if they stood alone. "Do not give them the pleasure of seeing you overrule a rule made to restrain heat." The master held himself still. He was not a fool. He could count favors. He could count eyes watching him. He could count the cost of standing on pride in the wrong plaza. The slave lies, he said, because that was the sentence men like him spoke when a slave's words dared to stand next to theirs. She broke a thing and was punished. The law permits correction. The law permits correction, the magistrate agreed. The law does not favor rage. The city does not favor scenes. He tilted his head toward the crowd, toward the statue, toward the quiet force of spectacle turning into judgment. Sell her, he said, within 2 days. Not to your friend next door. The steward sucked a breath through his teeth. The master's eyes went flat and cold. The clerk scratched the order onto the tablet. The lictor shifted 1 foot. The mule driver let out a breath he had been keeping since the fig harvest last year. The girl who sold soldered wine pointed with her whole arm and said to a man beside her, "Do you see? Do you see?" Tiro felt his legs. They were still under him. He felt his heart. It had not broken his ribs to get out. Dasa bowed her head to the bronze for 1 slow beat and then rose to her feet. She stood taller than she had yesterday, though the same body wore the same tunic and the same pain. She looked at the master. She did not look long. Her eyes passed over him like water over a stone. The magistrate looked at Tiro now. "And you," he said, "are you the same house?" "Who I am," Tiro said. "Then return," the magistrate said, "and dear the gods be wise. A house that makes many scenes grows poor in friends." It was both advice and warning. It said, "I will not protect you every time." It also said, "Not today." They walked back. The street closed around them and opened again. A man shouted about fish, a woman called her child, a cartwheel hissed on sand. Life moved on, as it always did when one small human thing had happened in a corner of a large city. At the gate, the doorkeeper's eyes were wet. He pretended to cough. He opened the door. Inside, the air had a new shape. News moves fast where fear lives. The cook stirred without tasting. The tutor wrote without seeing letters. The cellarman coughed and did not dare stop. The steward's mouth was a thin line. The master stood in the atrium with a face like a wall. "So," he said. It was 1 word and also a promise that the day ahead would not be like other days. He could not undo the order. He could delay, but only by 1 dawn and 1 dusk. He could choose the buyer, but not the neighbor. He could lower Dasa's price to punish his own purse, but pride rarely strikes its own face first. He did the thing men do when a hand is forced. He looked for another hand to close. His gaze settled on Tiro.
"You taught her insolence," the master said. Tiro bowed his head. "I helped her be seen." The master's lip lifted a little. "Seen is not a thing a slave should be." I told the steward to bring cords. He told the men of the house to clear the bench. He told the others to watch, because a house learns what it sees. Tiro felt the cold walk up his spine like water poured from a jug. There were laws, yes. There were statues and officers and judges who loved quiet more than noise. But the space inside a private wall still bent toward the will of the man who owned the keys. The cords came. The bench waited. The flagrum hung in its place like an animal asleep. The master did not reach for the lash, not yet. He reached for a collar, iron, with a ring that could take a chain. He held it up so the light caught the metal. "This is for runaways," he said. "This is for those who teach others to forget their place." The doorkeeper's eyes closed. The cook's spoons stopped moving. Dasha took 1 step forward and then stopped, because she knew she must not turn a single scene into 2. The collar was cold against Tiro's neck. It smelled like rust and old water. It was not heavy, but it carried a weight that could crush a thought if the thought was weak. The steward set the pin. It clicked. The ring on the collar knocked once against Tiro's collarbone when he swallowed. He met the master's eyes. He did not lower his own all the way. He lowered them halfway, a line between obedience and a tiny, hidden claim that a person may still see. The master smiled then, a small shape that did not reach his eyes. He spoke as if to a child who had broken a toy. "You will come with me tomorrow," he said. We will visit the cross outside the city where the road is wide. We will look upon a good, clean warning. You will carry the water jar for me and hold it steady. You will stand until your legs shake. You will see what happens to those who raise their heads without leave. The room grew close. The word cross stood in the air like a black door. Tiro tasted iron. The master was not claiming a right he could not use. Crucifixion hung there, not for every fault, not for this one, not today, but as a shadow that men like him like to drag behind them. If not the cross, then the mines. If not the mines, then a chain. If not a chain, then the lash. Punishment was a ladder, and he stood near the top with his hand on many rungs. Tiro nodded once. He did not trust his voice to carry a straight line. He looked at Dasa. Her face said nothing. Her eyes said, stand. He thought very fast and very clear of another rule that did not live on wax tablets, but lived in the long memory of those who dwell low. When open roads closed, use closed roads. When a hand points to the sky, look at the ground under his feet. The master planned to make a lesson out of a sight. He planned to move Tiro across the city, past gates, past guards, past places where a collar might not be enough to keep a man from slipping into the crowd. He planned to humiliate. He might, without meaning to, open a door. Tiro lowered his eyes at last. He made his breath slow. He felt the iron on his skin. He listened to the water in the pool and the small scratch of a mouse behind the wall and the high, sweet call of a boy whose world still had nothing in it that could not be fixed by someone else. He began to build a second plan, one that would grow from the thin seam of tomorrow's journey. If a house can hurt in private and then use public pain to teach fear, what happens when the road to the cross becomes a road to somewhere the master does not expect? Dawn bled into the streets in a thin gray ribbon. The iron collar kissed Tiro's skin with its dull, cold mouth. He barely slept. Every small noise in the night, footsteps, a cough, the scrape of a jar, had sounded like a key turning or a chain being tested. Now the day itself was the chain. The master ate early. He liked to begin harsh lessons on an empty stomach. He took a cup of watered wine and a heel of bread. He barked 2 orders that had nothing to do with Tiro, just to put the house back into a shape he liked. Then he lifted the travel staff that he used in the city to clear slow bodies from his way. He nodded to the steward. He said to Tiro, "Come." They stepped into the morning river. Rome was a busy throat, swallowing carts and voices. A mule snorted, a caged songbird scolded the light, a fishmonger raised a wet knife that caught the first strip of sun. Tiro felt the iron ring knock once against his collarbone as he walked. He forced his steps to match the master's, half a pace behind, never ahead, never dragging. They moved toward the southern gate. The Appian Way began there, straight as judgment. Beyond the walls, the land opened, and the roads were lined with tombs, stones, and stories carved into faces that could no longer speak. Outside the city was where Rome put its warnings. Crucifixion was not allowed inside the sacred boundary. The cross belonged to the open ground, where wind could say the law out loud. Dasa did not come. The magistrate's order had made her a problem to be solved by sale, not a tool for the day's cruelty. She was kept inside, away from the street. The steward's eyes had been careful on her all morning. The doorkeeper had looked at her hands and at Tiro's neck and said nothing, the way men say prayers in their heads and hope a god is listening. Tiro carried a clay jar of water. It was heavy enough to tire his arm if he held it wrong, light enough to swing if a man needed a sudden weapon that would break once and never again. He did not plan to swing it. He planned to make the day look smooth until the road bent in his favor. The master did not speak much as they walked. He liked to let the city talk for him. The press of bodies moving aside, the way eyes slid away from the iron at Tiro's throat, the lictors they passed, who did not stop him because there was no law being broken here, only a lesson being taught. The old way, by fear, by sight, by the story of someone else's ending. Near the gate, the air changed. City smells thinned. Fields breathed. The road widened. Stone slabs underfoot became regular and hard. Carts hummed low. The master staff clicked. Tiro counted sounds and distances. He watched the line between soldiers and civilians, the gaps in watchers, the routes that ran like small streams away from the main road, paths to quarries, to gardens, to ditches. A man could roll into and vanish for a breath and be found again 2 breaths later. They passed a group of chained men pushed along by guards. They were not being taken to crosses. They were being taken to the quarries or to the mines that ate lives like a mouth eats bread. Iron collars with side rings kept them in a line. One man's lip was split. Another's eyes were old in a young face. None looked up because looking up can be a kind of hope, and hope was a luxury that cut like a beautiful knife. A short distance off the road, near a gravel pit, a cross already stood. It was empty. The wood was dark with old weather. The upright post had a shallow notch where a patibulum, the crossbeam, would rest when the condemned arrived. The ground around the base was trampled into a circle by feet that had come to look at fear when there was nothing else to look at. The master pointed as if showing a fine building. "There," he said, "we will stand here when the hour comes and you will not look away." Tiro looked. He did not look long. He let his eyes touch each part so his memory could hold it. The notch in the stipes, the shallow holes where wedges had been hammered to pin wood to wood, the rope burns that told of men hoisted up with more muscle than care, the black stain that could have been old pitch or old blood. He knew the steps of crucifixion as stories, not as bruises. He had watched from far edges before. Slaves knew. Everyone knew. A man condemned would carry the patibulum, the heavy crosspiece, on his shoulders. The upright was already in the ground. Sometimes a tablet, the titulus, was hung on his neck or nailed above his head to tell the world his name and his crime. The soldiers would make a show of it because a warning must be a show or it is just a tree. The place, the man would be stripped. He would be tied or nailed, wrists to wood, feet to the post. Some crosses had a small seat of wood, a sidile, that pressed between the thighs to keep a body alive longer. Death came slow, by exhaustion, by breath failing, by the heart pounding itself empty as the chest fought to lift against the weight of both arms. If death came too slow and the crowd grew bored, or the soldiers grew thirsty, legs could be broken with a heavy blow, curifridium, to hurry the end. Sometimes a sponge with sour wine, pasca, touched a mouth cracked with thirst. It was mercy that was not mercy at all. It was a way to keep a show going. The master liked that Tiro knew these things just enough. He wanted knowledge to work like a leash. He wanted Tiro to see the closed world and think the far world impossible. He pointed to the spot where watchers would stand. He put his foot there as if to claim it with a shoe. "You will hold the jar," he said again. "You will not blink." Tiro set the jar down and tested its weight on the ground as if settling it. He marked distances in his head, to the ditch, to the cart track, to the nearest stand of low trees, to the slope that led toward a cluster of small tombs with broken faces. He noticed 3 boys climbing a stone, laughing at nothing, then stopping to stare at the cross with the complicated excitement boys feel around danger they can still walk away from. He noticed a peddler with a tray of cheap sweets that stuck to teeth and a bundle of little brass charms for travelers. He noticed a soldier rubbing his knee and wishing for a seat. But that last one mattered. Soldiers were the step between a master's plan and the world's rough rule. Some loved the work of making men suffer. Some hated it, but did it because orders were orders. Some loved the part where they won coins in little games while the slow dying went on behind them like weather. Tiro watched for which kind stood here. Soon the condemned arrived. 2 guards led him, one pulling, one pushing. He was a slave. That much was clear in the cut of his hair, the scar of an old collar, the color of fear that hung on him like a second tunic. He carried the patibulum with his arms tied to it, rope-biting wrists. His steps stumbled. A bruise shadowed one cheek. He was young. As his titulus said theft, Tiro read the scratch letters. It could have been true. It could have been a word, written by a hand that wanted a story to be simple. Many men in Rome were called thieves who had stolen only a chance to breathe. The master drank the sight like strong wine. He wanted Tiro to drink it too. "Look," he said, not loud but firm. "Learn." The guards set the patibulum on a trestle. They pushed the condemned to the ground. One soldier knelt on a forearm, another held a knee with a boot. The hammer came down. The sound did not carry far. It was solid, like a short piece of sky falling into a box. The body arched. A breath tore itself out of the young man's mouth. The boys on the stone went quiet. The peddler stopped calling. Even the master's staff paused in the air before he leaned on it again as if settling into a theater bench. Tiro looked. He did not make his eyes kind. He made them exact. He watched the way the soldier's weight pinned the palm so the nail did not split flesh the wrong way. He watched the way the rope was set to lift the joined wood without jerks. He watched the way the second nail found the point where the bones would hold but nerves would scream. He learned what he had not wished to know. The crosspiece went up, it slotted into the notch. The young man's breath became a saw cutting through smoke. His feet were fixed, either by nails or by ropes Tiro could not see from where he stood. He saw the small wooden peg, the sedile, press into the man's lower body, forcing him to push himself up for air and slide down into pain again. It was a device that stretched time like a hide pulled tight on a frame. The soldier settled. A pair sat on a rock. One took out a small bag of knuckle bones. Another brought a piece of bread from his pouch and dipped it in a cup. Their faces were ordinary. They could have been men waiting for a cart to be loaded or for rain to pass. This was work. Work has its ways, and that ordinariness lay the deepest lesson. A great cruelty was not only the act, it was the habit that made the act part of a day. The master watched Tiro's face. He was pleased to see it pale and hard at once. He mistook hardness for breaking. Sometimes they look the same at first. "Do you know why Rome does this?" he asked, softly, like a tutor with a good question. Tiro kept his voice even. "To warn," he said, "to shape fear into wood." "And to teach slaves that the body is not theirs," the master added. "It is ours to use and to end." He said it as if explaining a simple rule of accounts. How much grain, how much oil, how many lives? Tiro held the jar tighter so his hands would not shake. He did not answer. He let silence be the only answer a slave could give that showed any kind of spine in a place like this. Hours passed differently at a cross. For the dying, each breath is a climb up a hill that grows steeper. For the watchers, time is a slow river. People come, look, and go. Boys return with different boys. A woman covers her child's eyes and then does not. A merchant spits because spitting is a cheap way to feel strong. A farmer stops to rest and counts the breaths as if counting rows he will hoe later. Tiro counted too, but not breaths. He counted patterns. Every time a cart came from the city, the soldiers glanced up just in case it carried something for them, a message, a cup, a friend. Every time the young man groaned at a certain pitch, one soldier winced and looked away for a blink as if a tooth ached inside his head. Every time a shadow passed across the ground, the wing of a bird or a cloud, the master's eyes lifted for the tiniest moment to the sky, as if the gods might be watching their own law being acted out. In those tiny movements lived the spaces where a plan could breathe. At the 4th hour, a vendor of figs came down the road with a pole across his shoulders and baskets hanging from either side. He called his price in a sing-song voice. The soldiers waved him close and bought 2 handfuls. The master took 1 fig without paying because he could. The vendor bowed and smiled the way men smile when they do not wish to die over a piece of fruit. He moved on, the basket swinging, figs like little hearts in woven cages. At the 5th hour, the young man on the cross tried to speak. The words did not carry. His mouth shaped a name. It might have been a mother's, a friend's, or a god's. No one leaned in. The wind did. At the 6th hour, a mule stumbled and threw a pack. A dozen heads turned. The soldiers stood to see if they would be asked to help. They were not. Still, their knees were tightening and loosening, their attention stretched thin by the pull of another small story. The pack, the mule, the curse, the road. Tiro moved then.
He did not run, he did not shout. He took 3 steps toward the jar as if to adjust its place in the dust. He let his foot catch the lip. The jar tilted, rolled, and fell. It cracked with a dry pop. Water, warm from the sun, spilled into the road and ran in a quick, bright tongue across the stones. "Clumsy dog," the master said, almost with pleasure, because the small cruelty of a scolding is sweet to a man who has already washed in larger cruelty. He turned his head to see how much was lost. In that head turn, 1 heartbeat too, Tiro slid half a step away from the place he had been told to stand, and into the shallow trail of the water. He knelt fast, one knee in the dust, as if to salvage a useless thing. The water made a smear on his leg, dark against the pale cloth. He dragged his fingers through it and pressed them to the iron collar. Wet metal bites less than dry. Sweat helps, water helps more. He stood with the collar slick and the pin damp. He did not touch the pin. He did nothing but stand and watch and count and breathe. 5 more carts passed. A cloud's edge softened the light. The vendor with charms returned from the far side of the bend and tried again to sell the same small brass gods for a little protection on long roads. A bee worried at the sweat on Tiro's bare forearm. The master sighed once, the way men sigh when they are pleased, and bored in the same long breath. At the 7th hour, a pair of officers rode by toward the city. The soldiers stiffened to attention because habit holds even where there is dust and blood. The officers did not stop. They did not look at the cross long. They looked at the men standing beside it. That is how rank works. And then it happened. Not an accident, not a miracle, but the kind of small worldly thing on which bigger things can hang. A cartwheel hit a stone at a bad angle and popped off the axle. The cart tipped, a crate split. The street exploded in noise as fruit burst and people shouted, and the beast balked, and the driver leaped the wrong way and landed on his hip. Everyone within 20 paces turned for a breath. Tiro did not waste that breath. He lifted his hand to scratch his neck. It was a natural motion. He did it with 3 fingers and the inside of his wrist, not with the thumb and forefinger that would have looked like picking a lock. He slid the damp pin a fraction. It moved because water had found its way, and because the iron was old, and because a God who watches small things nodded once. The master turned back, saw Tiro's hand at his neck, and smacked it away like a father smacks a child who's playing with a scab. "Leave it," he said. "I itch, Lord," Tiro answered, and let his eyes fall all the way this time, flat and harmless. Another hour passed. The sun went lower. The wind stiffened. The young man on the cross sagged and surged, sagged and surged. His fingers had gone numb. His feet bled around the nail-heads like dark flowers. The soldiers spoke of dice and of a woman in a lane who laughed like a bell. The master spoke once of a debt owed to him, and once of a dinner he wanted the cook to make tonight. He did not speak mercy's name. He did not speak any god's name either. Men like him did not need gods. They borrowed the city's law and wore it like a cloak. Tiro shifted the pin again, the smallest slide. He felt the collar loosen a hair's breadth. He did not let relief rush in. Relief is loud. He kept it behind his teeth like a hard seed. He had thought once of running here, of slipping into the crowd and becoming one more body in the noise. But there were too many soldiers, too many eyes, too much iron that would shout from his throat. The road was open and therefore dangerous. His plan grew in the opposite direction, inward, behind walls, through doors a master would open himself. He thought of the doorkeeper. He thought of the steward's count. He thought of the night. The master at last tapped his staff and said, "Enough." He had had his fill of fear on display. He had shown Tiro the wall and expected Tiro to love the house more for being allowed to stand beneath its shadow and still be alive. He turned back toward the gate. On the walk in, he was generous with his words, which meant he was generous with his contempt. He spoke of slaves who had forgotten their place. He spoke of Dasa as a cost he would recoup at sale. He spoke of Tiro's collar as a teacher of memory. He spoke as if he owned breath. Tiro walked, jaw cracked in his hand, collar damp on his neck, plan narrow and sharp inside his chest. They re-entered the city. The streets thickened. The smells grew close: garlic, Sweat, smoke, tannery stench like old vinegar. The master greeted a man he disliked and smiled the way men smile when their mouths obey before their hearts do. They passed a temple. A flute whined somewhere. A child dragged a stick along a wall and counted the beats. At the house gate, the doorkeeper opened before the second knock. His eyes met Tiro's for a breath that pretended to be nothing. The iron ring at Tiro's throat made a small clink against bone as he swallowed. The doorkeeper's hand, rough as rope, flinched at that sound and then went still. Inside, the steward raised his head. He looked at the collar. He looked at the jar. He looked at the master. He saw that the day had gone the way the master wanted. He let his face go empty, which is the only safe face to have when a man of rank is pleased with himself. "Tonight," the master said, "I will have lamb with garlic and wine. And tomorrow, after the sale is done, I will visit the baths. The steam will remind me how soft the body becomes under heat." He said body, the way a collector says coin. In the kitchen, Dasa moved carefully, as if her bones were wrapped in thorns. She did not look at Tiro. He did not look at her. Looking is a kind of thread that can trip feet. Evening came. Lamps breathed oil scent into the halls. Shadows melted into corners. The house heard the day settle like dust. Night is a second city. Doors speak softer. Steps choose their sounds. Fear sleeps with one ear open, and hope rises from where it hid under a tile. Tiro lay on his pallet with the iron cold against his skin and counted the steward's rounds by the pattern of the footsteps. He rose when they passed to the far side. He went to the courtyard and sat by the pool the way he had sat on other nights. He held the cracked jar as if he had come to examine the break and decide if the piece could be mended with pitch. He did not mend it. He set it on the stone. He reached up, slow and ordinary as if rubbing a tired neck. He pressed the damp pin. It slid, then stuck, then slid again. The collar loosened around his throat like a fist that had decided to drop one finger only. He did not remove it. He let it hang looser, enough to twist, enough to lift and set down again without the metal biting as hard. He breathed. Beyond the courtyard, the doorkeeper shifted on his stool. The sound was a man choosing between sleep and duty. Tiro whispered, without moving his lips. He spoke one word that sounded like a cough. "Tonight." The night listened. He needed three things: a door, a timing and a purpose that was more than flight. He did not plan to run into the wide world with an iron ring shouting on his neck. He planned to run a line through the heart of the house, to Dasa's sale, to the keys, to the steward's book where prices lived, to the master's seal that made lies into truth and truth into law. If he could touch those things, even one of them, he could bend the day that was coming. If he could not, he would prepare a shorter road, a tool hidden, a pin loosened. A friend warned, a candle moved near dry cloth. He did not love fire. It killed the wrong people first, but the thought sat in his mind like a coal with its own breath. He hoped not to feed it. A mouse scratched. A tile ticked as it cooled. Somewhere in the alley a drunk laughed, like a man trying to cough bread out of his throat. The moon rode up over the lip of the roof and made a pale stripe on the pool. Tiro stood. He tucked the cracked jar under his arm. He crossed the courtyard, as if going to the storeroom for a shape of clay to test against a lid. His feet remembered where the mosaic creaked. His hand remembered where the hinge squeaked. His breath remembered how to be a small thing that hides inside a larger thing. At the storeroom door he paused, he listened, he slid the pin. The collar loosened another finger's width. He smiled to himself, a small, tight smile no one could see. Then he touched the latch. On the other side of the house, the master turned over on his bed and muttered a word that could have been a dream or a threat. In the atrium, the household gods watched with blank eyes. In the kitchen, Dasa dozed on a stool, her head bent, her back a sky map of dark new stars. Tiru pushed. The wood moved. What waits in the dark is not always a blow. Sometimes it is a door that opens onto a choice that will hurt no matter which way you step. The storeroom breathed dust and fettle. Oil jars stood like quiet soldiers. Baskets of figs and onions made soft shapes in the dim. A mouse ran, stopped, listened, ran again. Tiro let the dark settle around him like a cloak. He knew this room the way a sailor knows the sound of his own ropes. He knew where the steward's small chest sat. He knew which box was for extra lamp wicks and which was for the tools no one admitted the house owned. He closed the door behind him and counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. He slid his fingers under a folded cloth and felt wood. The small chest's lid had an iron tongue that fit a slot. The key hung on the steward's belt by day. By night, the steward put it under his pillow. Men like him trust iron most when it is near their teeth. Thibaut did not have that key. He had flame. He lit a wick from the lamp he had brought, then held the small light close to the chest's join. Old wood remembers. Wax, dropped once from a candle in a hurry, had filled a gap. He warmed it with the lamp until it softened and glistened. He pressed his nail. The seal flaked. The lid shifted a hair. He slid a thin sliver of bone, saved long ago from a broken comb, into the seam. He felt for the iron tongue. He lifted, not straight up, but at the angle that took the pressure away from the simple ward inside. The bone creaked. He held his breath so the sound would not carry farther than his own chest. The lid clicked. He lifted it a finger's height, then two. He did not raise it more than needed. The hinge would groan if he asked too much. Inside lay the little things that give a house its voice in the street. Wax tablets tied with string, a roll of papyrus for cleaner copies, the master's signet in a small wooden case, 2 extra keys, a purse with coins counted to the ounce and marked in the steward's neat hand. Tiru did not touch the purse. He took the signet case. He set it on his thigh and opened it. The gold ring glowed like a small moon. The stone face carried the master's mark, a running dog and a line beneath it. Tiro had pressed seals many times while standing behind the master. He knew the feel of the weight, the pressure needed to make the mark clean without cracking the wax. He took 1 wax tablet. Its surface held the shallow scars of old words smoothed away and new words pressed in. He warmed the wax just enough to take a fresh line. He took the stylus. His letters were good. He had learnt them when serving a kinder man years ago, but he kept them plainer now, closer to the steward's hand. He wrote what he needed the morning to be. By order of the house, the girl Dasa is to be sold at first light to a buyer not of immediate neighbourhood. Price set modest to speed the sale. Defects declared. None save recent punishment for house discipline. Not a runaway, not a thief. Payment in coin on the stone. Witness, steward. Seal affixed. He paused. He listened. The house shifted, settled, breathed. A drip from a roof eave made a slow pulse in the courtyard. He pressed the signet. The wax took the dog. The line lay straight. He breathed again. He added a second line on another tablet for the steward alone. Debt to the baker on Vesta Street to be paid from the sale before noon. Price lowered by 1/10 to hurry the matter. The master has guests for the afternoon. No delays. The steward liked debts made right. He liked orders that made his day smooth. He liked tablets that spared him from asking the master 3 questions in a row. Tiro was not making a lie the house would choke on. He was making a lie the house might swallow because it tasted like order. He put the tablets back with the signet, set the bone sliver to the lock's tongue, lowered the lid, pressed the iron tongue home, and rubbed the warm wax seam flat with his thumb. He blew out the lamp and stood in the dark until his eyes learned it again. He left the room as he came, quiet as a thought a man refuses to say out loud. In the courtyard, the doorkeeper sat with his back to a column, chin on chest. His hands were open on his knees. He could sleep like that, upright, ready to be awake in a breath. Tiro did not wake him. He moved past, a shadow from one pool of night to another.
He paused by the kitchen. Dasa slept on the stool, her head bent forward. He watched her chest rise and fall. He counted 4 breaths and felt the iron ring against his skin as if to remind himself that his own breath was borrowed. He returned to his pallet and lay down with his eyes open until they closed without asking him.
Morning came clean and hard. The house shook itself, buckles clicked, sandals slapped stone. The cook scolded a boy who had burned his fingers on a pan. The master's wife asked for a new veil. The steward's steps came quick and square, and his mouth held a list. He winced to his chest. Tiro did not watch. He carried a tray past the door and let the sound tell him what happened. The lid lifted, the papers shifted. A small breath came out of the steward's nose, the sound men make when something is as expected. The chest shut. The key scraped. The steps moved toward the atrium. "Sail at first light," the steward said to the master. The master nodded, pleased with his own decision he had not made. "Good," he said, "not to that squealing neighbor. I do not want my problems strolling past my gate." "Debt to the baker to be settled first," the steward added. "Do not pay the whole," the master said out of habit. "Leave him hungry." The steward inclined his head and did what he had already said he would do. They brought Dasa into the light. Her back had been washed. The marks lay there, dark and high. She wore a clean tunic. Her hair was bound simple. The steward fastened a small plank, the titulus, on a cord and hung it around her neck. It said her name, her age, her house, and the facts as the Aedil's edict demanded. Not a runaway, free of disease, sound in speech, punished for house discipline. The law liked words put in the open. The Aedils, the market magistrates, required sellers to name defects so buyers could not say later that fraud had been done. If a slave ran, the seller must say it. If a slave was sick, the seller must say it. If a slave had been thrown to wild beasts and somehow lived, even that must be told. On the day of sale, truth and lies walked beside each other on strings. They walked to the market. The forum was not only for speeches, it was for business and bodies. Traders called, lawyers argued, beggars held out broken bowls like dry mouths. Near the steps of Saturn's temple, a row of slave sellers kept their places. Some had platforms, some had chalk to make a dull skin look bright. Some hung garlands on the new stock to make buyers smile. Some hung heavier signs, a teacher of Greek, a nurse, a cook, one who lies. A cheap musician scraped at a reed pipe and made the morning sound like a clogged throat. The house took a square of stone. The steward stood with Dasa. Tiro stood slightly behind, the iron collar loose enough to move under his hand if he dared, and tight enough to remember itself. The master did not come. He liked the goods to be counted, but not the counting. He sent a small man with sharp eyes to watch the price. Tiro looked for one face. The mule driver was there, as promised, leading on his pole like a shepherd with no sheep. He raised his chin a whisper, which was as loud as a shout in a place with many ears. Beside him stood a woman of 40, with flour in the lines of her knuckles and a scar from a burn on her forearm. Her veil was plain. Her sandals were good but not new. The smell that followed her was bread and ash. This was the baker of Vesta Street, a widow who kept her ovens hot by will and by habit. She had 2 boys and 1 old slave who limped. She needed hands that would not steal and would not break. The steward called the price. It was lower than the master would have said if he had been the one to shape the morning. It was low enough to move a buyer with a tight purse and a true need. The woman stood still. Buyers know not to be first across the stone. First buyers pay more. But the mule driver shifted as if finding a pebble in his sandal, and the movement drew eyes from other bargains for a heartbeat. In that small shade the woman stepped forward. She looked at Dasa the way a woman looks at a tool she will use and a person she will have to wake in the dark. She asked the questions the Adiles liked buyers to ask, so sellers could be held to their words later. The steward answered cleanly because he had planned for this exchange, even if he did not know he had planned it.
Age?
19. From where? Cappadocia, by way of the coast. Speaks Latin? Well enough. Runs? No. Deos? No. Whitmark's new? Yes. He's right. House discipline. No theft. No plot. The woman nodded once. She named a price 1/10 below the plank. The steward frowned, as a steward must, and then bowed a fraction, as a steward will when told by a tablet to hurry a matter. They moved to the stone for coins. The woman pulled a tied cloth from her belt and set it down. The steward took out the house's scale. He measured. He tested 1 coin on his tooth without shame. He slid a few back and held out his hand for 2 more. The woman's mouth tightened. She added 1. He waited. She added the last. He wrote the amount on a tablet. He pressed the house seal. He did not notice that the mark he loved had slept in a different palm an hour earlier. Done, he said. The law liked witnesses. A man from the seller's side and a man from the buyer's side put their names down. The Adile's clerk, bored and careful, watched from a stool under a little awning and lifted his quill at the right moment. Dasa's titulus was taken off. A simple cord was tied around her wrist, the baker's mark, so there would be no question if hands changed in a crush. Turo let his chest loosen 1 band. The steward turned to him. "Pay the baker on Vesta Street," he said, meaning the man the master owed, not the woman they had just dealt with. "Then return. The master eats at noon." Tiro bowed. He took the second tablet, the one that named the debt, and tucked it into his belt. He felt the iron ring tap bone. He moved fast, but not too fast. He took side lanes, a man with a jar and a collar might take. He paid the debt with the house's coin at the old baker's counter, while the widow counted hers at the forum. The old baker grunted thanks the way men say water with a dry mouth and little else. Tyro took the signed slate that said "paid" and slid it with the tablet. He walked back, heart straight for the first time that day. At the corner, before the forum, the small man with sharp eyes stepped into his path. He was the master's watcher. He was paid in favours and by never being beaten in public. He had seen many mornings. He had learned to notice the difference between a steward's face when he obeys and a steward's face when he obeys, because his hand has been guided in the night. He smiled, but his mouth stayed thin. "The steward's letters are neat," he said. "Always the same height. Today, they looked a little tired." "Morning does that," Tiro said. "Also," the man said, "the master does not like his prices set modest. He likes them set like teeth. He will ask, he will sniff, he will taste the trail." "Then let him taste the coin," Tiro said, "and the quiet." The small man's eyes went to the collar. They went to Tiro's hands. He was deciding whether to be the kind of man who sees something and lets it slide, or the kind who sees something and makes it a rope. He leaned close. His breath smelled like sour wine. "Which door will you use when you go?" he asked. "I go nowhere," Tiro said. "We all go," the man said. "The only question is whether we walk or are dragged." He stepped aside. Tiro crossed the forum and rejoined the house square. The baker woman already turned away with Dasa at her side. The mule driver stood not far off, watching without seeming to. Dasa looked once back, one quick cut of her eyes to find Tiro. She did not lift a hand. She did not risk a word. But in that look lived a thing that was not fear. It was something harder to carry and easier to live on. Tiro dipped his head the smallest fraction. It could have been a fly, it could have been a prayer. Then the breath of the morning changed. The master came. He had told himself he would not soil his feet with market dust. He had told himself he had better things to look at. But pride is a hound that runs after its own shadow. A neighbour had spoken to him at the corner and said, "I hear your girl went cheap," and that had made him change his sandals and come.
He stood with his body like a pulled bow.
He looked at the empty square where Dasa had stood. He looked at the steward. He looked at Tiro's collar. He looked at the tablets. He held out his hand. The steward gave him the tablet with the seal. He looked at the seal long. He loved that dog. He loved it more than he loved most living things he owned, because it was himself, and could not argue with him. "Who sealed this?" he asked. "You did," the steward said, because the tablet said the house, and the house meant the master, even when another hand had pressed the ring. The master's jaw made a small line. He tilted the tablet under the light. He studied the wax edge. "Sometimes," he said, "a man can feel the weight of a hand behind a seal." He lifted his eyes. They were quiet and cold, like a pond that does not like stones. He reached for Tiro's collar. The iron moved under Tiro's fingers. The pin he had loosened in the night slid a hair, then stopped. The master's thumb pressed at the ring, felt the damp rub marks, the way metal had turned a little on skin when it was not meant to. "You itch often," the master said. "Always in summer," Tiro said. The master half smiled. "We will see," he said. "We will see who itches when the lash speaks." He raised his hand. Before it fell, a shadow cooled the stone. An aedile had stepped from his stool. He had seen the scene many times, the moment when a seller would strike a slave in the market and the law would be bent like a reed because no one felt like standing the reed upright. He held a staff, not a rod. His power was market power, a different kind of law, still sharp. "By whose seal?" the aedile asked, not to Tiro, not to the steward, but to the master himself. The master turned as if annoyed by a fly, but he did not swat. Aediles could make fines grow like mould in a damp room. "Mine," he said. "Then your word is done," the aedile said, nodding at the space where Dasa had stood. "The sale is clean, the day moves." He might have stepped back, he might have let the house finish its private lesson in a public place. But he had seen the iron at Tiro's neck, and the way the small man with sharp eyes watched it. He had seen many mornings. He had learned the difference between discipline and sport. "And this one?" the aedile said, pointing his chin at Tiro. "Is he for sale too, or only for show?" The master's face made the smile it made when a guest told a joke he did not like and he must pretend a little while. "This one learns," he said. "In the market," the aedile said, "the law learns too." A breath held the square. The master lowered his hand a finger's width, then lifted it again half that much. Pride and calculation wrestled in his wrist. Men like him preferred to win twice, once by force, once by rule. He looked at the tablet again, at his own dog pressed there by another man's breath.
By whose seal? The aedile asked a second time, softer now but closer.
The master did not answer. He looked at Tiro. He looked at the iron. He looked at the steward, who looked at the ground, because the ground was the only safe thing to look at when a door in a day swung on a hinge no one had planned to use. The master's thumb slid on the iron ring at Tiro's throat. The pin moved.
The collar loosened enough to speak a secret only skin can hear. What happens when a hand that believes it owns all weight feels the iron slip and the day's lesson turns to point at the man who planned it? The master's thumb pressed the iron ring. The pin shifted. Tiro felt the collar loosen a touch, then catch again. The aedile's eyes were steady. The steward stared at the ground. People nearby went quiet in that way a market does when it smells trouble and does not yet know from which hand it will land. The aedile spoke first. You have sold one, he said, nodding toward the empty space where Dasa had stood. The seal stands. The law for sale stands with it. Strike in your house if you must, not here. The master did not like to be told where his hand could fall. He did not like seals that worked without him. He very much did not like that a crowd could see him pause. Pride rose in him like hot smoke. He lifted his palm a little higher. Then Tiro moved, not away, but down. He knelt. He did not collapse. He did not cling. He knelt the way Dasa had knelt at the bronze, slow, exact, with his hands open on his thighs and his face lifted so the light could see it. The iron ring at his neck flashed once. He said one sentence. I asked to be sold for cruelty. It was a simple sentence. It was also a heavy one. It used a thin door, already built into Rome, by men who feared heat in other men's hands. In some ages, a slave could kneel at the emperor's image or before a magistrate and ask to be sold away. If a master beat past measure, a judge might refuse, a judge might agree, but the asking was a thread a person could still hold. The aedile looked at Tiro, he looked at the collar, he looked at the master, he looked at the people watching, buyers, sellers, a clerk, a widow with flour on her knuckles, a mule driver with a pole across his shoulders, a child with a plum. Stand, the master said. Tiro did not stand. The aedile lifted his staff a finger's width. The market is a place of rules, he said. If you wish to teach by the lash, do it under your roof. If a slave asks to be sold for cruel use, and he asks it before the law's eye, I may hear. I do not free. I do not judge hearts. I keep order. He turned to the steward. How many scenes will this house give me this week? The steward did not answer. He could not. He was a hinge between two hands. The aedile turned to the master. You may strike him in your hall, he said, and your friends will nod. But if you strike him here, I will fine you, and I will set the sale myself for the sake of quiet. Choose. The master's mouth made a small, hard line. His eyes cut to the small man with sharp eyes. They cut to the seal. They cut to Tiro's throat where the iron had the shine of water in its seam. He lowered his hand. That the sale, he said, each word a coin he did not want to spend. The aedile nodded once. He did not smile. He did not enjoy this. He enjoyed tidy squares and tall columns and coins that balanced. He liked the law when it kept people from shouting at the same time. He called the clerk. He named the day, tomorrow. He named the rule, not to a neighbor, not to an enemy, not to a friend who plays at being neither. He wrote a small fine for market noise. He wrote a larger one for the lash lifted in a place where grain prices were being set. He told the steward to bring Tiro tomorrow to the same stone at first light. He told the master that if he brought the lash instead of a purse, he would go home lighter anyway. The master bowed the smallest bow a proud neck can make without breaking. So be it, he said, and made it sound like, remember me. He leaned close to Tiro. He spoke soft for his slave only. If you leave one chain, he said, you will find another. Never believe you are anything but a tool the city moves. Tiro kept his eyes on the edge of the aedile's staff. Tools still choose where to rest, he said, not loud, not bold, but clear. The master turned and left with the steward. The small man with sharp eyes lingered. He looked at Tiro's hands. He looked at the iron. He looked at the Aedile, who had begun already to listen to a seller complain about spoiled oil. He leaned in as if to see a fly on Tiro's cheek. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "the collar still sits." He touched the ring with one finger and felt the play in it, the small looseness water had bought. He flicked the ring so it clicked against bone and walked away with a face that said, "Nothing." The square exhaled. The noise returned in layers. Pipes, barter, the caw of a crow, the call of a man boasting that his onions were sweet this year. The widow, with flour on her knuckles, stepped nearer, as if by accident, as if to look over a basket of dates. The mule driver took one step closer and then stopped because he had learned to move in halves. Tiro stood. He did not look at them. He turned and walked back toward the street that led home, because until a seal was pressed and coins were counted, home was still that house. The night was narrow. The air felt tight. The house spoke in small sounds. Ladles against clay, footsteps, a door closing, the boy's voice reciting lines and stumbling on a hard word. The master said little. When he did, his voice bent every word into a stick. The Tiro lay with his eyes open and the iron cool on his skin. He could not make tomorrow safe, but he could try to shape it. He went again to the storeroom in the dark. He did not touch the chest this time. He did not touch the seal. He took a small scrap of papyrus and wrote a name, the Widow Baker, Vesta Street. He wrote one number, half the price the steward had gotten today for Dasa. He wrote 2 words, "Will read." He meant letters. He meant accounts. He was not only hands. At dawn, he slipped the scrap to the mule driver in the lane, a breath, a blink, a pass. The man tucked it into the crack in his staff as if it were a sliver of wood and not a line that might bend a day. Then Tiro took his place by the door. He did not run. He wore the collar. He held a jar that was not cracked. The steward brought him to the forum. The Edile was already there. He was a man who liked to get ahead of noise. He set his stool, he straightened his robe, he glanced once at Tiro, once at the steward, and then turned his face to the square like a man about to lift a lid from a pot. Buyers came, men who needed strength, women who needed hands, a shopkeeper who needed someone to stand in a doorway and look honest, a farmer who needed a back and did not care about a face. The steward announced the sale with the voice of a man who sells a cart, clear, cold, exact. 1 male slave, he said, literate, used in the house, collar for correction, not a runaway, not a thief, sold by order. The master did not come. He did not want to look at the reed that had bent him yesterday. He sent the small man with sharp eyes again. The man stood with his hands tucked in his sleeves and made his mouth look like a thin knife. The first buyer to ask a price was the farmer. He offered low. The steward frowned. The second was the shopkeeper. He offered a bit more and asked if the slave could count. "To 20, the steward said. He meant much more, but words are tools in markets, and you do not sharpen them for strangers. The third was the widow. She said no number at first. She said, "Can he keep accounts and read my board when I am too tired to see straight?" "Enough," Tiro said, because the question was to him this time, and the Aedile did not stop him. The widow named a price that was not an insult and not a gift. It was the number on the scrap. The steward's mouth opened and shut. It was low. It was also clean. It would put the matter to bed. The small man with sharp eyes made the smallest shake of his head, just enough to say, "Raise it." The steward raised. The widow raised a hair. The farmer grunted and stepped back. The shopkeeper scratched his beard and muttered about boys who lie with numbers. "Done," the Aedile said. Faster than stewards like, slower than widows fear. He would rather settle quick than watch pride climb back onto the stone. He held out his hand for the tablet. He took the ring. He pressed the seal himself this time. Coin sang on stone. The scale balanced. Witnesses signed. The clerk lifted his quill. The iron ring at Tiro's throat clicked once as he swallowed. The solemn, "Remove it," the Aedile said to the steward. The steward looked at the small man with sharp eyes. The small man looked at the seal. The steward set his mouth and reached for the pin. It's like there. The iron fell into his hands with a sound like a door closing softly. Tiro's skin felt sudden air where metal had slept. A thin line was pressed there, red and pale. He did not touch it. The widow tied a simple cord around his wrist. the mark of a new house. She did not tug. She did not drag. She said, "We bake early, we sleep when the oven sleeps. You will count for me when smoke stings my eyes." Tiro nodded. "I will count," he said. They left the square with steps that were not fast and not slow. The mule driver watched them go. He lifted his pole and leaned it the other way, the way men do when a load changes sides. The small man with sharp eyes turned his head as they passed. "Tools still choose," he said under his breath, "not kind, not cruel, curious." "Tools still cut," Tiro said, "because some words are best said once and then left to do their work. Ears do not fly, they stack." Tiro learned the weight of flour and the sound of a hot loaf when it is done. He kept accounts that were clean and simple. He wrote notes in a hand that did not draw attention. He walked to the forum at dawn not to be sold, but to buy grain. He learned the price of oil in spring and the price of wood after rain. He learned that a small shop has its own law: work, order, quiet, bread at sunrise, rest when the last hearth cools. Dasa lived 2 streets away. The widow had a cousin who knew the cousin of the baker who bought her. News travels on the threads women tie between houses and on the lanes mule men walk. Dasa healed. She kneaded dough and hummed a tune from the coast where she was born. Her back carried scars that would never fade. Her face carried something else, a line of peace along the mouth that people get when the hand over them grows steady. When the widow's sons grew, the shop grew. When coins lined up in the box like soldiers, the widow did the thing some do who are not cruel and who love order. She freed the old slave who limped and paid him to sit by the door and scare thieves with a voice that still held iron. The law had ways to free: a ceremony with a rod, a list carved in a tablet, a witness from the magistrate's office. Freedom was not a story told in smoke. It was a stamp and a fee and a name that moved from one column to another. Tiro did not ask for his name to move. He saved. He kept a small purse, a peculium, by leave of the widow, as some slaves did in kinder houses. He did not hide it. He did not boast. He added coins the size of fingernails and coins the size of small round leaves. He bought his freedom after 3 winters and 1 summer. He stood in the forum before a clerk and an aedile and a witness and held very still while the rod tapped his head and a name changed shape. The world did not break. The sky did not sing. He went back to the shop and worked the next day. The work was the same. The law around his body was not. He did not forget the house with the pool. He did not forget the seal with the running dog. He did not forget the empty cross with a notch in its post and the young man's breath like a saw in smoke. He did not forget the iron ring, the feel of water in a seam, a pin sliding a hair's width because a cartwheel popped at the right moment. He used his free name to do small things that mattered. He wrote letters for people who could not write. He read contracts for women who sold bread and did not like to be tricked. He told a boy who had watched a flogging from across the street that it is not brave to look long at pain. He showed him instead how to count change fast, so a customer could not cheat him. He took a runner by the elbow when the runner breathed, "Should I kneel?" And he said, "Yes, but keep your eyes up when you kneel and do it where the law is close enough to hear." He did not become a hero in any book. He became a man who slept without iron on his neck and who kept his shoulders straight without needing a strap of wood to force them. In Rome, that was not nothing. In any city, it is not nothing. Where was the lesson? The master had wanted one lesson only: fear. He had wanted to show that bodies are wood for other men's fires. He had wanted to say, "This is the end of the road," and point at a cross. That the city had its own old rules, and even those rules, bent and thin, could still catch a falling life. A law made by a cautious emperor to cool hot hands saved Dasa from a house that would have eaten her slowly. A market rule kept a lash down where prices were measured. A seal pressed on warm wax by a different palm still counted as a seal. A cheap clay jar, a handful of water, a pin that slid because the day made a gap. Small things worked together because a mind refused to break. Rome was cruel. It was also layered. Power stood tallest, but under its feet, habits and laws and eyes in the street could make small paths. Slaves learned those paths by heart. They used them to survive, to move, to breathe, sometimes to rise. They paid in scars. They paid in years. They paid in quiet. The cross did not vanish. It stood beyond the gate, and it would stand for a long time yet. Men would still be nailed to it. Crowds would still come. Soldiers would still eat bread while watching bones struggle. Law would still favor the strong more days than not. But the story is not only of crosses. It is of hands that open when told to close. It is of neighbors who shout at the right time. It is of widows who count cleanly and do not lie. It is of doorkeepers who shift bolts for reasons they never say. It is of stewards who love order more than pride and who sometimes let a day be shaped by a tablet that appears at dawn with neat letters and a seal they did not press. It is of people who kneel and keep their heads lifted so the light can see their faces. It is, in the end, a story about what power can do and what people can do beneath it. Fear teaches one kind of map. Memory teaches another. Tyrell learned both. He used the second to walk off the first. And us? We live far from Rome, but we still live with rules, with seals, with markets, with crowds, with hands that want to rise and fall. We still live with doors that open when someone dares to ask and when someone else chooses not to look away. We still live with small chances that matter. Remember the broken clasp that taught the wrong lesson. Remember the iron ring that slid when watered. Remember the law that stirred itself in public and kept a lash down for one morning. Remember the baker's cord that replaced iron. Remember that great cruelty can be a habit, and that the answer to habit is not rage, but plan, witness, and steady hands. This is not a clean world. It was not then, it is not now. But in Rome, as now, the human heart could still choose to be a weight the world must reckon with. Not loud, not grand, steady,